Welcome to the bedtime book of history. Now, gently close your eyes. Let the full weight of your body surrender to the softness beneath you. Feel each breath, like a gentle tide, washing away the fatigue of the day, allowing your thoughts to slowly settle. We will not be chasing the hands of time, nor will we try to solve the riddles of history. This will be an immersive companionship. We will become a silent travel companion, following a distant soul, from the first time he gazed upon an unfamiliar sky, through his days of sun and storm, until he falls asleep. This isn't about knowledge. It's about feeling. It is a whisper in your ear, guiding you into a tranquil dreamscape. Now, let everything go. Is about to begin. I was born in the year of our Lord 1452, on a spring night in the Tuscan countryside of Enciano. My father, Ser Piero, was a respected Florentine notary, a respectable, pragmatic man who lived by laws and contracts. Caterina, their union was brief and passionate, but it was not blessed by the church, and so I, Leonardo, was born a bastardo, an illegitimate son, in my childhood, but it ultimately became my greatest freedom. I could not inherit my father's surname, nor could I enter his profession. I was barred from the grand avenues paved by bloodlines and tradition, and because of this, that wilderness was my world. My childhood was not spent on Latin grammar or family ledgers, but in the winds of the Arno Valley. I belonged to the olive groves, the vineyards, and the babbling brooks of Vinci. My first teacher was nature itself. I was not learning. I was simply seeing. I could spend an entire afternoon motionless, observing the vibration of a dragonfly's wings, the transparent membranes shimmering with iridescent colors in the sun. Its every hover and dart contained principles of mechanics I could not yet understand. I would lie in the grass and watch the clouds gather and disperse, imagining them as slow moving mountains in the sky, or as armies about to wage war. I chased lizards just to see their lightning fast movements across the rocks. I pressed my ear to the ground to feel the vibrations of distant hooves. My father had another family in Florence, so I was raised by my grandfather, Antonio. He was a kind old man who never reproached me for my birth. He simply let me roam the fields, and with his wrinkled hands, he would stroke the various stones and strange paths I brought home. My first studio was a cave in the hills of Vinci. I drew on the rock walls everything I saw, circling birds of prey, even fire breathing monsters from my imagination. I became fascinated with the play of light and shadow. How did sunlight filter through the gaps in the leaves to cast dappled patterns on the ground? How did candlelight trace the contours of joy or sorrow on a human face? I realized that lines could only describe form, but only light and shadow could give a soul to life. My father brought me to Florence. The city was utterly different from the tranquility of Vinci. It was a crucible forged of stone, money, and genius. The city's ruler, Lorenzo de' Medici, known as the Magnificent, was turning it into the cultural heart of all Europe. The air smelled of pigments, freshly cut marble, and leather. The streets were filled with scholars debating Plato and artists arguing over perspective. My father saw my talent for drawing, and perhaps he also wanted to find a respectable path for his illegitimate son. He took me to the workshop of Enria del Verrocchio. Verrocchio was one of the most renowned artists in Florence. Not just a painter, but also a sculptor, goldsmith, and engineer. His workshop was the artistic center of the city. Figures like Botticelli and Perugino, who would later become famous, all studied there. Entering Verrocchio's workshop was the first great transformation of my life. The creation of my voice was not a sudden event, but a decade-long process of forging, carried out in Verrocchio's noisy, crowded workshop, thick with the scent of turpentine and molten metal, the clash of geniuses, and endless curiosity. The workshop's morning always began with the bells of the Duomo. We apprentices would crawl from our cots, and our first task was not to pick up a brush. Master Verrocchio believed that a man who couldn't sweep a floor clean could never draw a pure line. His workshop was both a temple of art and a crucible of discipline. My daily work began with the most basic chores. Grinding pigments was a tedious but vital discipline. I would place hard lapis lazuli on a marble slab and grind it, circle after circle, with another stone. My arms would ache terribly, but my mind was focused on observing how the stubborn blue mineral gradually turned into a powder as fine as dust. I discovered that the force and the proportion of linseed or ladid would all affect the purity and luster of the final color. I began to record these formulas in my notebook. Perhaps these were my first scientific experiments. My companions were a group of brilliant young men. Sandro Botticelli, a few years my senior, was an introverted and melancholic poet, lost in painting goddesses and Madonnas with elegant, flowing lines. His paintings always carried a kind of ethereal. We would often sit by the Arno during our afternoon break. He would speak of Neoplatonic philosophy, and I would show him my strange sketches of machines. He didn't understand them, only smiling and saying, "Leonardo, your head is not filled with pigments." Then there was Perugino, a shrewd Umbrian whose style was serene, sweet. He learned early on how to please wealthy patrons, knowing which compositions and colors would sell best. He sometimes mocked me for spending so much time studying the anatomy of a single muscle, considering it a pointless waste. The client wants a Madonna, not an anatomical chart, he often said, between us. But also a silent competition. Master Verrocchio was adept at using this. He would have us collaborate on a painting, each responsible for a part. A commission to create silver tableware for the Medici. Sandro and I were tasked with engraving the patterns. He engraved flowing ivy, while I became obsessed with sculpting a lizard resting on the vines. I spent 2 days catching a live lizard to observe the texture of its skin and how its color changed in the light. In the end, my lizard was so lifelike it seemed ready to scurry off the silver plate. Winning the master's praise, Sandro wasn't jealous. He just patted my shoulder and said, "You gave a soul to that little creature." The true turning point was the painting The Baptism of Christ. When Master Verrocchio announced that he was entrusting the kneeling angel in the lower minus left corner to me, the entire workshop fell silent. It was a signal, in the apprentice system. To be allowed to independently complete a significant part of a painting meant you had transitioned from a learner to a creator. I didn't begin to paint immediately. For the next few weeks, I didn't grind pigments or prepare panels. Instead, I went to the various churches of Florence and sat in the corners, observing the people who came to pray. I watched their devotion, their confusion. He should be the connection between the divine and the human. His gaze should be able to carry the prayers of mortals and guide them toward the sacred. I also visited the cloth merchant shops. I couldn't afford their expensive silks, but for a single coin, I would ask the shopkeeper to let me touch the fabrics, to observe how they folded and reflected light, possessing both weight and fluidity. Most importantly, I had to find a face for the angel. I didn't need a handsome boy as a model. I needed an expression. I finally found my inspiration in the choir. There was a young boy, and when he sang the hymns, his face held a transcendent serenity. I didn't draw his face directly. I captured his essence of being present, yet seemingly absent. Back in the studio, I made a bold decision I would use oil paints for my section. This technique from the Netherlands was still novel in Italy. Most painters were accustomed to the fast minus drying egg tempera, but I needed the slow minus drying property of oil, which would give me ample time for layering and creating soft transitions. I began by laying down a very pale undercoat, then added transparent glazes, layer by layer. I did not use sharp lines to outline the angel's form. Instead, with countless tiny brushstrokes, I blended his body into the surrounding air, rocks, and water. This was the nascent form of what I would later study obsessively. In my notebook, says effuma to like smoke, without borders, a natural transition. For his golden curls, I didn't paint them strand by strand, but painted how the light fulgulced among them. I reworked his eyes no fewer than 20 times, finally settling on a complex emotion effito as a mixture of compassion. He gazes at the Christ, as if foreseeing the cross he is destined to bear. When Master Verrocchio first came to see it, he was silent. with his rough hands, which had shaped countless masterpieces. He gently touched the part of the painting with the angel's robes, feeling the smooth texture of the pigment. He didn't look at me, but whispered, as if to himself, This was not painted." The other apprentices gathered around. Perugino's face showed a trace of incredulous jealousy. But Botticelli, with his unique poetic gaze, looked at the painting and said, "Leonardo, you did not paint an angel. You painted divine light itself." After that day, the atmosphere in the workshop became somewhat delicate. Master Verrocchio did indeed devote more of his energy to the colossal bronze statue of Christ in the street. Thomas he was creating for the Florence Cathedral. He sometimes asked me to help him calculate the volume and weight of the molten bronze, an acknowledgement of my engineering talent. But I knew my time as an apprentice was over. I was no longer the boy who imitated his master's style. I had found my own voice. It was a language that fused scientific precision, the mystery of light and shadow, and profound psychological insight. This city was about to hear my voice. Also had a faint sense that this voice might not be fully understood by its time, for my curiosity had long since ceased to be satisfied with merely being a painter. My soul yearned to fly. After leaving Verrocchio's workshop, I established my own studio in Florence, carried on the wings of that angel in the baptism of Christ, spread quickly. Commissions flew in like snowflakes. Churches, monasteries, and wealthy merchants all hoped to acquire a work of mine. A city that loved art as much as it loved gossip began to see me as its rising star. Yet, beneath the weight of fame, I felt a growing restlessness and confusion. Every commission, for me, was not a business transaction but a new exploration, a puzzle to be solved. When the monastery of San Donato commissioned the Adoration of the Magi, I didn't simply pile on lavish robes and expensive gifts as other painters did. I placed the Madonna and Child at the center of the composition, surrounded by a nearly frenzied crowd. Their postures and expressions were varied, displaying the raw shock, adoration, and ecstasy of witnessing a miracle. I tried to capture the entire spectrum of human emotion in a single painting. In the background, I painted battling knights and crumbling architecture, symbolizing the collapse of the old world and the birth of a new faith. I drew hundreds of preparatory sketches for it, studying geometric composition, human perspective, and the dynamics of horses. I was completely absorbed, forgetting to eat or sleep. But my patrons did not want my process of discovery. They wanted a finished product to hang on their walls on time. They could not understand why I needed to spend months statue of a horse, or the twitch of an old man's facial muscles in surprise. "Leonardo," more than one priest or merchant frowned at me. "We just need a beautiful painting, not a philosophical treatise on human nature." My procrastination and perfectionism began to earn me a bad reputation. I would accept a commission, take the deposit, then pour endless time into preparation, only to often leave the work unfinished. For when I grew tired of one problem, or when my thoughts were captivated by a new, more fascinating puzzle, I would abandon the brush without a second thought. My mind was a wild horse that could not be bridled. While composing the Adoration of the Magi, I might get distracted by the fright of a bird and begin designing a flying machine. While studying the chemical composition of pigments, my thoughts would drift to how water could be harnessed to power machinery. My notebooks became the battlefield of my thoughts. They were filled with my mirror writing a script I used to protect my ideas. Written in reverse, they contained gears, levers, anatomical drawings, designs for war machines, and treatises on light and shadow. For me, was becoming more and more like a cage. The beauty it could contain could not contain all of my thoughts. The artistic circle of Florence also began to suffocate me. Botticelli was lost in his world of myth. Perugino was content with his serene and formulaic religious paintings. We were friends and rivals, but I knew we walked different paths. They sought harmony and perfection on the canvas, while I sought to understand the laws governing the entire universe. I felt this gulf during a meeting with Lorenzo de' Medici. He was a great patron of the arts, but he was an even shrewder politician. He admired my talent but was impatient with my impractical fantasies. He needed artists who could bring glory to the Medici family, not a scientist trying to dissect the world. Just as I felt lost, an opportunity from the north appeared like a beam of light, illuminating my predicament. Ludovico Sforza, nicknamed Il Moro the Moor for his dark complexion, was recruiting talents from all over to aggrandize his court. I made a decision that would change my life. I would leave Florence for Milan. To this end, I wrote what is perhaps the most famous letter of application in history. In this letter, I placed my most prized talent, almost as an afterthought. The first 10 paragraphs were dedicated to detailing my abilities as a military engineer. I wrote, "Most illustrious Lord, having now sufficiently considered the specimens of all those who proclaim themselves skilled architects of instruments of war, and finding that their inventions do not differ in any respect from those in common use, without prejudice to anyone else, I have plans for bridges, very light and strong, and suitable for carrying very easily, with which to pursue and flee from the enemy. When a place is besieged, I know how to remove water from the moats and make endless variety of bridges, scaling ladders, and other instruments. I will make covered chariots, safe and unassailable, which, entering among the enemy with their artillery, there is no body of men so great that they would not break them. In time of peace, I believe I can give perfect satisfaction and to the equal of any other in architecture and the composition of buildings, public and private, and in guiding water from one place to another. I can carry out sculpture in marble, or clay, and also I can do in painting whatever may be done, as well as any other, be he who he may." Only at the very end did I add, almost dismissively also, "I can do in painting whatever may be done, as well as any other, be he who he may." This letter was my farewell to Florence and my redefinition of myself, but to a place that could accommodate all my impractical dreams. I yearned for a patron who would not only appreciate my paintings but need my mind, my engineering knowledge, and my creativity. In 1482, at the age of 30, carrying a lyre, I had made myself an instrument of silver, crafted in the shape of a horse's head as a gift for Ludovico. I left the unfinished masterpiece, the adoration of the Magi, in my Florence studio, like an unfulfilled dream of the past. My future, in the court of Milan, would be inextricably bound with war, and an immortal dream of bronze. Milan was utterly different from Florence. Florence was a republic of merchants and bankers, where art and ideas grew in relatively free air. Milan, however, was a duchy founded by a mercenary captain, and its atmosphere was thick with intrigue, military power. Its ruler, Ludovico Sforza, ambitious man with an insatiable hunger for glory. He needed me not just as a painter, but as a universal genius who could add luster to his court and design weapons for his army. Here, at last, I had found the stage I had dreamed of. The nearly 20 years I spent in Milan were the most productive and stable of my life. My title was court painter and engineer, but that title hardly encompassed the roles I played. I was more of the Duke's creator of marvels, a magician who turned his fantasies into reality. My brush, first and foremost, had to serve the Duke's desires and glory. Ludovico Sforza was a ruler of great and undisguised passions. He adored his wife, the beautiful Beatrice d'Este, but he made no secret of his mistresses, whom he installed in prominent positions at court. The most favoured among them was the young, intelligent, and well-educated Cecilia Gallerani. When the Duke commissioned me to paint Cecilia's portrait, I realized it was more than just a painting. It was an official acknowledgement of an unofficial relationship, a work of art that needed to be handled with extreme delicacy and subtlety. I first met Cecilia in her private salon. She was not like the other court ladies, heavily made up and laden with jewels. She wore a simple blue velvet dress and was reading Petrarch's poetry. She spoke fluent Latin and could discuss philosophy with scholars. Her intelligence was her most captivating weapon. "Maestro Leonardo," she said upon seeing me, curtsying slightly, with no trace of unease in her eyes, "I have heard that your brush can capture the shadow of a soul. My lady, I replied, my brush only chases the light. It is the light that reveals the soul's contours. Our creative process was more like a series of conversations. I didn't make her sit rigidly like a puppet. I had her move freely about the room, talking with me about poetry, music, even her thoughts on the stars. I observed the subtle shifts of her lips as she spoke, the focused light in her eyes as she listened. I wanted to capture her mind in motion. The ermine was a stroke of genius on my part, but also a carefully crafted political symbol, which echoes the Greek word Gale, a clever nod to her surname, Galeroni. More importantly, the ermine was a symbol of purity. Legend had it that it would rather be killed by hunters than soil its white fur. At the same time, Ludovico himself had been awarded the Order of the Ermine by the King of Naples. This small animal praised the mistress's purity, while also representing the Duke's status, packaging a potentially scandalous relationship into an elegant allegory. The day the painting was finished, Cecilia stood before it for a long time. She reached out her hand, as if wanting to touch the soft fur of the ermine in the portrait. "You did not paint me," she said softly. "You painted me as he sees me, intelligent, alert, and forever his. It is a beautiful cage, maestro." I was speechless. I realized then that at court, art is never pure. A code. Besides painting, my more important duty was to design unparalleled spectacles for the family's various celebrations, weddings, receptions for ambassadors, anniversaries. For each occasion, Ludovico demanded that I create something never seen before, something that would showcase Milan's wealth and ingenuity. The most memorable of these was the wedding celebration for the Duke's nephew and Isabella of Aragon in 1490. I themed the entire event as the festive Paradiso, the Feast of Paradise. I transformed the grand hall of the Sforza castle into a vast, revolving cosmos. I designed a hemispherical dome, painted with the 12 signs of the zodiac and the 7 planets. This dome was controlled by a complex system of gears hidden backstage, powered by men, allowing it to rotate slowly, simulating the movements of the celestial bodies. As the guests entered, they found themselves at the center of the universe. Actors dressed as Apollo, Jupiter, and other gods would descend from the dome as their respective planets moved into position, reciting hymns I had written for them. The presentation of each course of the meal was synchronized with the arrival of a planet. When Mercury arrived, when Mars arrived, they would offer sizzling roasted boar. The climax was when the emissary representing the princess met the emissary of the groom at the center of paradise. At that moment, my mechanical devices would activate. At countless glittering stars, actually small pieces of paper dusted with gold would rain down from the dome, while hidden sensors released fragrant scents. The entire hall was filled with music and visual wonders. The success of this celebration elevated my fame to its zenith in the courts of Europe. But as a magician who could turn fantasy into reality. But only I knew how illusory and fleeting these ephemeral spectacles, created to please the powerful, were compared to the eternal science I truly pursued. After each celebration ended, I was left with a great emptiness, the void that follows creation. Of all my courtly duties, the bronze horse was the one to which I devoted the most effort, and the one that caused me the most pain. It was not just a sculpture. It was the ultimate test of all my knowledge of anatomy, engineering, and art. The process of building it was fraught with unexpected difficulties. Milan's summers were rainy, and the massive clay model would often crack due to the humidity. I had to design a complex internal drainage system to accurately sculpt the horse's muscles. I even built a small stable next to my workshop, keeping several different breeds of horses for constant observation. The citizens of Milan had mixed feelings about my Colossus project. Children would peek through the fence of my workshop with curiosity. Merchants complained that the project was too expensive and consumed too many public resources. Some artists and engineers openly questioned my plans to cast 70 tons of bronze in a single pour. I remember an architect named Giuliano proclaiming in a tavern, "It's pure fantasy. The molten metal will cool and solidify before it reaches the ends of the mold." Leonardo da Vinci is a painter, not a founder man. He will turn the Duke's bronze into a pile of useless scrap. These criticisms buzzed around me like gnats. I did not argue publicly. I just locked myself in my workshop, drawing hundreds of sketches of furnace designs and ventilation systems. I made many small wax models of horse legs and conducted repeated casting experiments. I proved that, with precise control of temperature and flow, my plan was feasible. In 1493, at the wedding of the Duke's daughter, I publicly displayed the 7-meter high clay model in the piazza. When the enormous curtain was unveiled, a gasp of disbelief rippled through the crowd. With its head held high and hoofs pawing the air, its muscles bulging with life, seemed as if it would break free at any moment and trample the entire square. At that moment, all doubts vanished. People believed I could truly work miracles. I stood in the crowd, watching their admiring gazes, but felt no joy in my heart. I knew the hardest part, the bronze casting, had not yet begun. I presented the final budget and list of materials to the Duke. But just then, the political situation in Italy turned volatile. King Charles III of France invaded Italy, and Ludovico, to protect himself, needed a vast amount of bronze to cast cannons. My immortal dream was thus crushed by the weight of political reality. Amidst these worldly turmoils, another immortal project was proceeding in parallel: the Last Supper. In the refectory of the Santa Maria del Grazie Monastery in Milan, Ludovico commissioned me to paint this wall. It was a theme painted by countless artists, but I was determined to give it a life never seen before. I did not choose the calm moment of the establishment of the Eucharist, nor the chaos after Judas was identified. I chose the most dramatic and psychologically charged moment of the entire story: the instant after Jesus calmly says, "One of you will betray me." I wanted to depict the 12 different ripples caused by these words, like a stone thrown into a calm lake. To capture these 12 different reactions, I roamed the streets of Milan. I observed people as they argued, worshipped, or tried to defend themselves. I grouped the 12 apostles into 4 units of 3, each closely connected yet distinct. Peter impulsively grips his knife. The young John bows his head in sorrow. Doubting Thomas points his finger. And Judas, I painted him on the same side of the table as the others, not isolated as in traditional depictions. He clutches his money bag, leaning back into the shadows, a dark and lonely vortex at the center of the commotion. The creative process was a struggle. I would often climb the scaffolding at dawn and paint until sunset, forgetting to eat or drink. But at other times, I would stand before the fresco for days, just gazing at it, not painting a single stroke. The prior of the monastery was extremely displeased and complained to the Duke about my laziness. I was summoned to explain. I said to Ludovico, "Your Excellency, a genius's inspiration does not always come from constant labor. Sometimes, when I appear to be doing nothing, I am in fact conceiving and perfecting the images in my mind. I am still searching for a suitable face for Judas. I cannot imagine what a vile face a man who would betray his Lord must have. If I cannot find one, I may be forced to use the face of our impatient and impertinent prior." The Duke laughed heartily, and the prior never bothered me again. To achieve richer detail and softer light, I abandoned the traditional fresco technique. Fresco painting requires working quickly on wet plaster. Once it dries, it cannot be changed. I invented a new method, applying a special undercoat to the dry wool, and then painting on it with oil and tempera, as if on a wooden panel. However, this innovation also sowed the seeds of a future tragedy. I did not anticipate that the humid air of Milan would become the most terrible enemy of this masterpiece. In 1499, when the army of King Louis VI of France invaded Milan, my 2 great mountains crumbled almost simultaneously. Ludovico's forces fled in haste to cast cannons to defend against the French. He ordered that the 70 tons of bronze I had prepared for casting the great horse be melted down. My dream of immortality was turned into the spoils of war, who, with their laughter and volleys of arrows, reduced it to a heap of broken mud. Looking at the crystallization of more than a decade of my hard work, now a meaningless pile of fragments, I did not weep. There was only a silence. desolate wilderness in my heart. Almost at the same time, I heard that, on the wall of the refectory of Santa Maria del Grazie, the Last Supper, due to my experimental technique, had already begun to show signs of peeling and mold. My glory, my masterpieces, the immortal things I tried to leave to the world, one destroyed by war, the other being eroded by time. I, Leonardo, engineer to the Duke of Milan, a failure with empty hands, stood at the threshold of my 50th year, forced once again to pack my bags and set out on the road of a wanderer. After leaving Milan, I became a wanderer without a fixed patron. I first returned briefly to Florence, where I designed underwater defenses against the Turkish invasion. I found an employer who was as unexpected as he was terrifying. Cesare Borgia. Cesare, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, was a military leader known for his ruthlessness, cunning. He was attempting to carve out an independent kingdom for himself in central Italy. His name was enough to strike fear into the hearts of the bravest mercenary captains. The later Machiavelli would model his ideal ruler in the prince after him. The meeting with the man known as Duke Valentino is still seared into my memory like a brand. It was in a castle in the Romagna. The air still smelled of gunpowder and blood, and soldiers' work leaning up the battlefield, and Cesare sat in the Lord's ornate chair, slowly and methodically wiping blood from his dagger with a silk handkerchief. He was very young, not yet 30, and as handsome as a fallen angel from a legend. But his black eyes held no warmth, only a pure, ice minus gold willen calculation. Maestro Leonardo, looking up with a slight smile that did not reach his eyes, design fortresses and divert rivers. And my kingdom needs order. What can you offer me? I did not speak of art or philosophy. I knew that before such a man, those things were worthless. From my leather satchel, I took out a map I had drawn of his next target city, Imola. It was not just a map. It was the result of a new method of cartography I had invented. Using my knowledge of geometry and surveying, I had rendered the entire city its walls. Even every important building from a precise bird's eye view, drawn to a perfect scale on a single sheet of parchment. It was an ethnographic plan, and at the time, no one else could produce its equal. It transformed a complexity into a geometric figure that could be completely understood and controlled. His fingers traced its lines slowly, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine interest appeared in his eyes. He compared it with the rough sketches drawn by his spies and immediately saw the vast difference. He said under his breath, more to himself than to me, "War becomes a game of chess. I can see my pieces, and I can see my opponent's weaknesses. Maestro, you are not an engineer. You are a sorcerer who can grant a man a god's minus eye view." He immediately appointed me his chief military architect and general engineer and gave me a signet bearing his coat of arms, authorizing me to travel freely throughout his territories, command any resources I needed, and inspect any fortress. And so, my life with the army began. I rode on horseback, following his disciplined and swift moving forces across the Romagna. My job was not to participate in the killing, but to measure, plan, and design. I would map the local terrain, assess the fortifications, and submit proposals for improvements. I witnessed his methods of rule firsthand. He would mercilessly sack a city that resisted, but for a city that surrendered, he would quickly establish order. He cleared out bandits, unified taxes, and made the trade routes safe again. He was like a cold, hearted surgeon, cutting away a rotten limb with his scalpel, indifferent to the patient's screams, focused only on the final outcome. In a small town called Cesena, I experienced something I would never forget. Cesare had appointed his most capable and brutal commander, Ramiro di Lorca, to restore order. Ramiro, with an iron fist, made the chaotic town orderly within months, but also in deep resentment. One morning, the townspeople awoke to find Ramiro's body cut in half, displayed in the central P as an extra blood-soaked tax. In this way, Cesare had both used Ramiro's cruelty and pacified the populace by executing him, casting himself as a just ruler who punished the wicked. I saw Cesare walk through the square without any expression on his face, as if the corpse were just an insignificant piece of furniture. At that moment, a chill ran down my spine. I realized I was serving a monster who treated humanity as a mere instrument. My knowledge, my maps, my engineering designs, they had all become cogs in his efficient machine of slaughter and domination. I threw all my energy into purely technical work to numb my conscience. I designed mobile fortifications for him and drew up a grand plan to divert the Arno River from Florence to flood Pisa, though it was never carried out. I immersed myself in numbers and the principles of leverage, trying to forget the nature of the man I served. During this period, my notebooks filled with designs for all sorts of weapons, Sith-D chariots, giant crossbows, even a prototype of a multi-barreled machine gun. These designs were a reflection of my mechanical fascination with pure destructive power, but also a projection of my inner comfort and fear. However, this dark period did not last long. In the summer of 1503, an unexpected event occurred. Cesare and his father, Pope Alexander VI, both fell gravely ill, most likely with malaria. And Cesare, though he clung to life, was bedridden at the very moment he needed his strength the most. The Pope's death was like pulling out a critical support pillar. The Borgia family's enemies, like sharks smelling blood, swarmed from all directions. Cesare's kingdom crumbled around him as he lay moaning in his sickbed. I slipped away from his camp quietly. I said no goodbyes and asked for no payment. I just packed my notes and instruments and extracted myself from the ruins of that power struggle. I had walked with the devil and drawn for him a map to hell. In 1503, I returned to Florence. The city was no longer as I remembered. The Medici had been exiled, and it was once again a republic. And the art world was now dominated by a young, ferocious, and dazzling new star, Michelangelo Buonarroti. My first direct confrontation with Michelangelo happened on an ordinary afternoon. I was walking down the street with a group of friends, discussing a line from Dante. At that moment, Michelangelo came walking from the other direction, covered in marble dust, his expression as proud and sullen as ever. One of my friends, hoping to ease the tension between us, pointed to him and said, "Leonardo, here is one who can explain Dante for you." Michelangelo stopped. His gaze was as sharp as a chisel. He ignored my friend and spoke directly to me. "You explain it yourself. The one who modeled a horse in clay couldn't cast it in bronze, and abandoned it in shame." His words were a poisoned dagger, striking precisely at my deepest wound, the destroyed horse in Milan. I looked at him, this man 20-3 years my junior, his face full of disdain and a nearly savage self-confidence. I did not get angry. I simply replied calmly, "At least I tried. Some are content merely to repeat the shapes of old stones." With that, I turned and walked away. I knew then that a war between us was inevitable. The head of the Florentine Republic, Piero Soder, and I seemed to relish the prospect of this war. He turned the massive wall of the great council hall in the Palazzo Vecchio into our arena. It was a public challenge, and all of Italy was watching. Our workshops were set up at opposite ends of the hall, separated by a screen, but we could hear each other. From my side, the subtle sounds of assistants mixing pigments and preparing panels. The powerful, rhythmic striking of hammers and chisels against the wall. My chosen subject, the Battle of Anghiari, was more than a historical reenactment. It was my ultimate meditation on the theme of war. It is not a heroic epic, but the howl of a beast. It is a vortex of fear, rage, and chaos. I focused all the action in the center of the painting, the brutal struggle full standard. I drew countless sketches. I studied the expressions of fighting lions and gave that ferocity to the horses. I observed the contorted faces of men in street brawls and gave that rage to the knights. The horses in my painting were no longer noble steeds. Like the men, they bared their teeth, their eyes bloodshot and crazed. The knights were driven by hatred and the instinct for survival, their faces deformed by their shouts, their muscles bulging with the strain. I wanted to paint the dehumanization of war. On the other end of the wall, Michelangelo's Battle of Cassino was a celebration of humanity. The scene he chose was full of drummer soldiers. Hear the alarm and scramble to arm themselves. This gave him the perfect excuse to depict the subject. He was obsessed with his entire life, the heroic. In his sketches, every figure was an independent sculpture. Muscles, bones, and sinews rendered with unparalleled tension and beauty. It was the ultimate end to the human body, God's most perfect creation. When our preparatory cartoons were finished, they were put on public display as required. All the artists and apprentices of Florence flocked to see them, comparing our works, whispering their opinions. A young Raphael, then just an up- coming painter, reportedly spent a whole day copying and studying our two cartoons. People called it the school of the world. Our two works represented the two peaks, the two different directions of Renaissance painting. Mine was introspective, exploring the depths of psychology and emotion. His was external, displaying the perfection of power and form. When this passionate vision had to be translated into a permanent fresco, my damnable, insatiable thirst for experimentation once again led me into the abyss. I could not bear the constraints of traditional fresco. I needed time, layers, the deep luster that only oil paint could provide. I scoured ancient texts and, in Pliny the Elder's Natural History, I found a recipe for an encaustic painting technique, supposedly used by the ancient Greek painter Apelles. I was ecstatic, believing I had found the solution. Mobile scaffold and began my experiment on the wall. I mixed my ground pigments with beeswax and turpentine. The thick, glossy texture fascinated me. I painted the central vortex of the battle, and the layering of colors and dramatic light effect exceeded even my own expectations. Then came the crucial step, heating the wall to fuse the paint into it. I had my assistant's light, a huge brazier filled with burning coals. We started with the lower part of the mural. The heat rose, and the pigments melted slightly before hardening again, bonding with the wall and taking on a soft success. I almost wanted to cheer for my own genius. Then, we slowly raised the heavy brazier to the upper part of the mural. But disaster struck. Because hot air rises, the heat at the top of the wall was far more intense than at the bottom. I heard a sickening sizzle, and then, before my eyes, the powerful horse heads and knightly faces I had just painted began to melt, run, and drip down the wall. The colors bled into one another, turning into an unrecognizable, ugly mess. The hall fell silent. My assistants stared at me in horror, their faces filled with despair. I could sense a muffled, suppressed snicker. It was Michelangelo. I stood there, still holding my paintbrush, but felt all the strength drain from my body. I was not looking at a ruined painting. I was looking at the epitome of my life's many failures. The great horse in Milan, the flying machines that could never take flight. And now, this wall, which I had melted with my own hands. I had tried to transcend my era, and my era, time and again, had thrown me back down in the most brutal fashion. This much minus anticipated duel ended in my public humiliation under catastrophic technical failure. Soon after, Michelangelo was summoned to Rome by the Pope to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and his Battle of Cassino was also left unfinished. The wall in the Palazzo Vecchio, which should have borne witness to history, was ultimately left with only two incomplete cartoons and endless regret. During this time in Florence, I also began a portrait. The wife of the Florentine merchant Francesco del Gioconda. I did not treat it as an ordinary commission. This painting became the culmination of all my studies of light and shadow, anatomy, and the human soul. I had her sit there, against a fictional landscape that looked as if it belonged to the dawn of the world. Using my signature S-affumed technique, I blurred the corners of her lips and eyes, making her smile elusive, as if changing from moment to moment. This smile belonged neither to her nor to me. It belonged to the projection of the viewer's own heart. I carried this painting with me, reworking it for more than a decade. It was no longer a portrait of a specific person, but a portrait of humanity itself. But, at the time, no one in Florence could understand. All they saw was a failed engineer, a painter who couldn't finish his work. In 1508, I left my native city once again, this time for Rome, abandoned by my own time. Rome, the eternal city. It was in the midst of a new golden age. Pope Leo X was drawing artists from all over the world to the Vatican with his lavish tastes. But this was no longer my era. Rome belonged to younger geniuses. The young man from Urbino had won the Pope's infinite favour with his elegant, harmonious style and was painting frescoes in the Vatican palaces. Then my old rival, Michelangelo, had just completed the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. That epic of creation made all of Rome tremble. I was given lodging in the Belvedere of the Vatican, and my patron was the Pope's brother, Giuliano de' Medici. He was a gentleman who treated me with great respect, but he could only offer me small, scattered tasks like studying how to drain a swamp or designing a special concave mirror. I felt like a relic, put on a shelf to be admired but not used. My mind was still active. My notebooks were filled with new ideas about geometry and hydraulics. I even began the deepest and most forbidden research of my life, human anatomy, working with a doctor from Verona. I dissected more than 30 corpses of different ages and genders by candlelight. Late at night, I was no longer satisfied with just muscles and bones. I explored the chambers of the heart, trying to understand the mystery of blood circulation. I traced the nervous system, hoping to find where the soul resided. I drew a fetus in the womb, its curled posture like a nebula at the dawn of the universe. I created hundreds of anatomical drawings of unprecedented accuracy and planned to write a complete treatise on anatomy. However, this research brought me disaster. Someone informed the Pope that I was engaged in sacrilegious activities. He issued an order forbidding me from ever touching a corpse again. My scientific path was brutally cut short. I felt a loneliness I had never known before. My right arm, due to a stroke, had begun to go numb, making it impossible for me to draw or write with the same freedom. I spent all my time organizing my thousands of pages of notes. I looked at the sketches and writings about flying machines, submarines, anatomy, and botany. They were like fragments of a vast labyrinth. I had spent my life pursuing knowledge, trying to piece these fragments together into a complete picture of the universe. But only in my old age did I realize that this labyrinth had no exit. The ocean of knowledge is infinite. In 1516, my patron Giuliano passed away. An invitation from north of the Alps arrived like a warm sunset, illuminating the end of my life. The young king of France, Francis I, a monarch utterly infatuated with Renaissance culture, invited me to his court. He did not ask me to paint, nor did he ask me to design war machines. He simply said, "Come to me, maestro. Live as my friend, talk with me freely, and conduct any research you desire." I accepted his invitation. I took my 3 most treasured paintings, the Mona Lisa, the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne, and Saint John the Baptist, along with all my manuscripts. Like a snail carrying its own shell, I crossed the Alps, next to his own Chateau d'Amboise. He gave me the title first painter, architect, and engineer to the king, along with a handsome pension. Here, I spent the last 3 most peaceful and honored years of my life. The king would often walk through a secret tunnel from his castle to my residence, without any attendants, and sit beside me like a student, listening to me talk about geometry, canal design, or the fantastic ideas about the cosmos that filled my mind. He would look at my notebooks, not with doubt, but with pure awe and curiosity. "Tell me, Leonardo," he often asked, "how did you come to know all these things?" I would just smile and reply, "Your Majesty, I know nothing. I am only a man who never stops asking questions." But my mind, until the very end, was still thinking. I designed new cities and organized my anatomical notes. It felt as if I were racing against time, trying to bring some order to the vast knowledge in my head, to leave something for posterity. On May 2, 1519, as I lay on my deathbed in Toulouse, I felt the flame of my life about to be extinguished. Legend has it that King Francis I was at my side, holding my head in his arms as I passed. This may be a later embellishment. But, in that moment, my heart was indeed at peace. I looked back on my life. I was an illegitimate son, a painter, an engineer, a scientist, a musician, a dreamer regarded by my contemporaries as an eccentric and a failure. The Battle of Engiri, the Great Bronze Horse, much of my scientific research, remained only on paper. My entire life was an unfinished symphony, but perhaps that was the meaning of my existence. My value was not in what I completed, but in what I explored. I proved with my life that the boundaries of human curiosity do not exist. I felt my consciousness detaching from my aging body, rising slowly, like the flying machines I drew in my youth. I saw the hills of Vinci, the dome of Florence, the plains of Milan, and the unfulfilled dreams of flight in my notebooks. My body will return to dust, but my questions will fly forever in the wind.